Hey everybody, this is Anne and welcome to Painting Big. Exciting day. It's like the new year. It's the first video of the new year. And today I'm going to go over the different types of blending. So hopefully you all will get a lot of this. It's going to be squishing a lot into a short period of time, so hopefully we get to everything. Also, we're starting with the new mini cam this week. Ooh, new mini cam. So we're giving it a try. This is similar to what Reaper has been using lately, although a more upgraded model. So we'll see how it does. I'm looking forward to your feedback from this one. All right, let's get to it. Minicam, there we are. So here's the new camera. Here, look, it has white balance. Like you can actually see my palette without it blowing out. It's kind of crazy, right? All right, so we're going to use the Frost Giant Queen's cape for this. She's a good one to kind of display the different types of blending. So we're going to start right away with saying there are generally two types of blending overall. And then you've got a lot of like little things and ways and techniques that people use to work with them. It's essentially wet into wet and wet into dry are the types of blending. So what we're going to be doing first is covering wet into wet. And you've seen me do this on a couple of videos in the past. So wet into wet is typically called wet blending. A two-brush blending is this type of blending, as is two-color brush. So often laying down a base coat is a good idea, as then you don't need to worry about your initial blend covering. And then you can essentially just concentrate on the blend itself if you've got a base coat down. If you're going to just go straight over primer with your wet blending, you can certainly do it. It's just then you also need to worry about, am I getting a coat that covers? You're probably going to use a lot thicker paint to make sure that it covers. And so these are going to be considerations you've got to think about if you don't put down a base coat. Putting down a base coat also lets you work with slightly thinner paint, which I like to do. Also with wet blending, you want to put more paint on the model because the more paint you are working with on the model, the longer it will stay wet. We are below freezing this morning, so my paint's going to dry really fast. So many people advocate using thicker paint for wet on wet. If you use this approach, you may find that a wet palette is the best choice for you. And you'll probably also find success with larger brushes. So keep that in mind. Larger brushes typically will carry a nice bigger load of paint that you're looking for. And so there's basic. Just wet and wet the way that I do it. And I'll keep bringing in, essentially I can add in more and more purple. I'm using, by the way, Stix Purple and Runic Purple, 9423 and 9424 from the Bones line. And you can see wet blending gives you a good blend. It doesn't necessarily give you the best blend unless you're going to sit and mess with it. So you can always take a little bit of your previous color, like the Stix Purple. And I'm working with these close to full strength. I'm using about 8 drops of paint and then about 1 drop of water just to keep things wet in the palette. And one thing with wet blending this way is that you usually don't get a really pure representation of either color. You get mixes, like blends. You can wait and put like pure drops of Runic Purple on at the end if you want to bring this up. Once this starts to dry though, this is key, don't touch it because you can strip up paint super easy. All right, so the only difference between a traditional wet into wet blending and two-brush blending is the extra brush. So I just did wet into wet. If I was going to do two-brush, then I'd be setting this up, and I'd be setting this up, and I would be grabbing an extra brush, which you usually want to keep damp because if you use a dry brush, you may find that you're going to strip up paint. And then I'm going to be working these together essentially with two brush. So lay down one, lay down the other. I personally I'm kind of fast, so I do what my boyfriend David always says is you pretty much do two brush blending with one brush. And this is true. This is true. And you can do it that way. If you're fast at rinsing out your brush, you can absolutely do two brush blending with one brush. And, you know, just like with the other blending, you can go and get more of your Runic Purple if you find that we've blended it all in and you want it to be a little brighter. Or you can put that highlight on at the end with layering. So there's, you know, kind of an idea. You can also do, what wet on wet is interesting for, is two-color brush. So two-color brush, you can do it two ways. You can load up your brush with your dark color and make it go up the brush a little bit more. So that's about 2/3 of the way up the brush. Then you pick up your highlight just on the tip. So you have two colors on your brush. I'm going to dab with just a little bit of that off. And then you're essentially, you have to be really good with placement here, but you can run this down the side of something and get a blend. You see? Just like that. Then of course you can use your wet into wet to blend in this other area. But you get a very nice blend. It takes, the thing about this one is that it takes practice to get a smooth blend. But there you go, that's how that works. And then let's also show you the two color brush that on a big area like this where it's a flat surface, you can actually use a flat brush. This one's too big, sadly, my smaller one's at home, but I do have a small angled brush and that will work just as well. So once again, you pick up your purple, and then you get a bit of your highlight purple on there, depending on how much you want. And you're just going to run it right down this fold. Let me get all this in focus. So there we are. And let's see how we can do with this. Now this is a bit of an odd surface, but you can see how it might work better with a flatter surface, right? So if you have a big flat surface like wings, you could use this to good effect. I can also go back in just with my two brush blending, grab a little bit more of my shadow since I lost it, and while it is still wet, this is key, while it is still wet, I can blend it. This is why you use thicker paint for this technique. It takes longer to dry. You also use more paint for this technique because that means it dries slower. So then you end up with, you know, kind of blends kind of like that. You can see that the two color brush techniques are going to be a little bit more subtle. And here, when you're doing the two brush blending or just the straight up wet blending, you have a little bit more control switching back and forth. You're not trying to get it all down in one go. So those are things to remember about wet into wet. Now, wet into dry. All right, so wet into dry is usually called layering. You are putting a wet layer of paint over a dry layer of paint. You usually need to build up several transitions of thinned paint to get a good blend. Technically, glazing counts and also washes count as a wet into dry technique because you're putting wet paint over a dry surface. Now, you do usually need to build up several layers, several transitions of paint to get a good blend all the way from your Stix purple to your runic purple, or any time you're doing this technique. Because you're working with thinned paint, you're probably going to get better mileage out of a well palette like this. It's going to allow you to keep your paint at the correct consistency for layering for longer. You want to use bigger puddles of paint because I usually use, just to give you an idea, 8 drops of paint, 1 drop of water. 8 drops of paint, 2 drops of water. When I get lighter, I'm getting more. This is about a 1-to-1 mix here. This is about a 1.5-to-1 paint to water. So, and this is about a 2-to-1. So you can see how you add more water as you get lighter in color. But because these are so full, you can see how the wells have a lot of paint in them. They're going to stay at this proper consistency for a very, very long time, which means that I could layer this entire cloak and not have to worry about rethinning my paint. It'll stay at the right consistency. Whereas when you work with thicker paint in a well palette, it tends to dry faster. And usually you're not using as much. You're not going to fill up this well with 12 or 18 drops of paint if it's going to dry fast and you're going to waste it. So that's why I say a wet palette when you're using thicker paint is a better option. However, for this video, I had limited time, so we're just going to jump right into it. All right, so we'll start out with a base coat that's similar to runic purple, which is about like that. We're going to grab a highlight color. It's about a 2-to-1. Oh, I'm using a bigger brush. That's the other thing. You usually want to use a thinner brush because you're using thinner paint. And so you can get away with, essentially, the finer your stroke on layering, the better your blend's going to be. If you go in with a big clunky stroke, you're going to have a hard time controlling the paint. Also, with a bigger brush, you're going to have more paint on the brush, so you're going to have a harder time getting the smooth lines you need. You're going to start with your brush pointed toward the shadow, and you're going to pull it toward the highlight. Let's get up here so you guys can see. And you're essentially going to build up the layers and leave some of your base color in the shadow there. Let's see if I can get to a good, there we go. So I just do thin parallel lines. You can also do cross hatching, you can do stippling, you can do any brush stroke you want with layering. And a lot of times you want to suit it to the subject matter of what you're doing. See, there we go. You can see the blend. And that's just with one layer. So essentially, here's a trick. If you're working with colors that are relatively close together, you can get away with doing thicker paint. But if you're working with colors that are very different, you want to work with thinner paint. So remember, this was about 2:1. And it works because the Runic Purple, one, doesn't have a lot of white in it. And two, it's actually pretty close to Stix Purple, especially when you thin it down. So you can get away with that. As you get lighter, that's when you need to thin it down more, or you're going to see brush strokes. But if you see brush strokes, you can glaze. We'll do a layering and glazing video at some point. It's a class I teach a lot at cons because I really feel like it's a central technique in your toolbox. There you go. Trying to angle it so you guys can see it. I'm going to bring it into focus here. There's a lot of light, I know, and sometimes that gives you glare. So let's see here. There we go. So as you can see, this is not yet as bright as here because I was using a lot thicker paint. Here, since you're using thinner paint, you need to build up a couple different layers before you get there. And I'm also not up to pure Runic. This is pure Runic for this highlight. So essentially, if I put a couple of layers, build up a couple layers of pure Runic Purple on here, you're going to see it start to come out more. You can see where I'm putting my paint, and I'm coming across. Now, you do always want to make your brush stroke opposite of the shape of the area. So this is a long, thin area, so I don't want to use this kind of stroke, or it's going to emphasize my brush strokes, because the eye is seeing this long and thin. If you use a long and thin brush stroke, it's going to see it right away. So instead, use a cross stroke. Essentially go perpendicular to the shape of the surface. And remember, you want to pull back toward the highlight, because that's where you're going to leave a little puddle of paint when you lift your brush up. So that's going to create a blend for you. But essentially, like so. Now, layering is a slower technique, as you can see, but it is very high precision. So, many painters will start with a wet into wet blend, but then use layering and its cousin glazing for finishing work and for especially for fine details where you really don't have room to blend. In 28mm models, it's hard to even wet blend something so small as a face. Wet blending is really good for setting up things like this cloak or large pieces of armor. But then when you really want to punch especially when you really want to punch your highlights, because again, when you're using wet blending, you're mixing two colors into each other, you don't always get the pure punch of your highlight color at the end unless you go back with layering. So then we can take this is about 6 drops of Runic Purple and 2 drops of white, and we can essentially use layering on top of our earlier wet blend to make sure that we get a nice punch of color on our highlights. Bring up our highlights, essentially. Toward the edge, it's okay to do a horizontal stroke, especially on these big, broad areas. Because usually, since it's a longer area, the eye won't pick it up necessarily. So you use a little bit of a layering stroke to pop your highlights. There you are. So those are the palettes that you want to use, the brushes that you might want to experiment with. I hope you guys have really enjoyed this video. I do hope you will get out there and experiment, because you learn the most by painting instead of watching my videos, even though, you know, my videos, I hope, are highly entertaining. Well, or at least moderately entertaining, right? You're watching somebody paint. You're watching paint dry. It's totally exciting, isn't it? Yes, it is. So anyway, that will be it for today, and I'm working on a couple of other videos that are in the works, so stay tuned for some sheer cloth and maybe some hair and maybe even some Zenith highlighting this month. I don't know, I've got a lot of subjects. I'm working on some very interesting projects, so we will see you guys again soon. This is Anne signing off.